On the morning of October 13th, 1899, the people of Selkirk, Montana, opened their eyes to a sight so impossible it would linger in the community's memory for generations. 7 beds inside the Thornfield home sat perfectly undisturbed, their covers still folded with the same military exactness as the night before. Yet those rooms felt as hollow as unmarked graves. The 7 daughters of Gabriel Thornfield, a prominent merchant, had simply dissolved into thin air. Margaret, 26, Catherine, 24, the twins Eleanor and Elizabeth, 22, Sarah, 20, Grace, 17, and little Rebecca, only 14. None of them left behind so much as a single footprint in the frost that dusted their window ledges that morning. Not a single window showed any indication of forced entry. No doors stood cracked open. And what troubled everyone most deeply was this: their nightgowns still hung exactly where they'd been placed before bedtime, as if the sisters had evaporated into the crisp autumn atmosphere. A report filed by the local sheriff, later sealed by federal authorities for nearly 80 years, contained one bone-chilling detail that officials flatly refused to discuss with anyone, including the girl's own father. Each bedroom showed unmistakable signs of having been thoroughly searched by someone who knew the house's layout intimately. And yet, absolutely nothing had been taken. No jewelry, no clothing, not even the small sums of money the older sisters kept stashed in their dresser drawers. What became of the 7 Sisters of Selkirk endures as one of America's most unsettling and unexplainable unsolved mysteries. But the truth buried inside those dusty government files reveals something far darker: a conspiracy woven from greed, corruption, and human trafficking that extends far deeper than anyone in that remote Montana town could ever have imagined. Before we continue with the Thornfield sisters' story and expose the shocking evidence deliberately hidden from public view for over a century, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these historical mysteries that uncover America's hidden truths. Also, take a moment to tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We truly enjoy hearing from our worldwide community of mystery enthusiasts, and your engagement helps us resurrect these forgotten stories. The investigation that followed would lay bare not only the fate of 7 innocent young women, but an entire network of predators who had been systematically dismantling families across the American frontier for decades. The autumn breeze sweeping down from the Bitterroot Mountains and winding through Selkirk streets carried with it the mingled aromas of wood smoke, fallen leaves, and that ever-present metallic tang of silver ore, the very element that had transformed this overlooked corner of Montana territory into one of the wealthiest communities situated between Denver and Seattle. By 1899, Selkirk existed as a town straddling 2 distinct worlds. On one side stood the rough frontier settlement it had been merely a decade earlier. On the other, the refined community it desperately wanted to become as Eastern money and influence flowed westward along the newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad line. With its population having swelled to roughly 800 souls, Selkirk embodied everything late 19th century Americans believed about opportunity, progress, and the boundless potential of Western expansion. The main street hummed with activity from dawn until well past nightfall. Freight wagons groaned under loads of silver, or as they rumbled toward the railway depot. Well-dressed businessmen stepped off evening trains arriving from Chicago and New York, while families who had journeyed thousands of miles saw chances to construct new lives in a place where a person's worth was measured by determination rather than pedigree. Yet beneath this shimmering surface of prosperity and advancement lurked the same tensions, plaguing communities throughout the American West. The rapid influx of both money and people had created sharp divides between established families who'd weathered the lean early years and newcomers arriving with Eastern capital and sophisticated business connections. Labor disputes constantly simmered between miners risking their lives daily in the silver shafts, and investors lounging comfortably hundreds of miles away. Most troubling of all were the whispered concerns about young women who had arrived with their families, but then mysteriously departed for opportunities in distant cities, leaving behind only vague explanations and tearful goodbyes. At the very center of Selkirk's transformation stood Gabriel Thornfield, a man whose remarkable success story had become legendary throughout the territory, yet was beginning to draw uncomfortable scrutiny from those wondering how a simple dry goods merchant could accumulate such extraordinary wealth in such a remarkably short span of time. Gabriel had first appeared in Selkirk during the brutal winter of 1892, driving a single wagon laden with basic supplies and accompanied by his 7 daughters, his wife having succumbed to pneumonia during their journey from Ohio. The sight of this determined widower and his children huddled around a campfire in the bitter cold had moved longtime residents to offer assistance, and Gabriel quickly established himself as both a shrewd businessman and a devoted father. Within just 2 years, Gabriel's modest general store had expanded into the largest commercial establishment anywhere between Butte and Missoula. He'd negotiated exclusive contracts with mining companies, established trading relationships with suppliers in Chicago and San Francisco, and somehow secured the financing necessary to construct the most impressive private residence in 3 entire counties. That 3-story Victorian mansion on Maple Street, complete with elaborate gingerbread trim, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch, served simultaneously as a monument to his success and a testament to his dedication in providing his daughters every advantage that money could buy. The 7 Thornfield sisters grew into young women admired and respected throughout the community, each developing distinct personalities and talents that enriched Selkirk's cultural and social life. Margaret, the eldest, possessed a razor-sharp intellect and natural leadership abilities that made her the most effective teacher the town school had ever employed. Her progressive teaching methods, which emphasized critical thinking and practical skills over rote memorization, drew praise from parents and education officials as far away as Helena. She was known for staying late to help struggling students, organizing advanced classes for gifted children, and tirelessly advocating for better resources and facilities. Catherine, just 2 years younger, had inherited their mother's artistic gifts and transformed them into a passion that enriched the entire community. Her paintings, landscapes capturing Montana's rugged mountain beauty, portraits revealing the character and dignity of frontier families, and still life's finding beauty in everyday objects, adorned homes and businesses throughout Selkirk. She'd organized cultural events that brought refinement and entertainment to the frontier town, including concerts, art exhibitions, and literary discussions attracting visitors from neighboring communities. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were inseparable companions who channeled their natural needlework abilities into a thriving seamstress business, employing several local women and providing services ranging from simple alterations to elaborate wedding gowns. Their shop had become a gathering place where women could discuss community affairs, share news, and support each other through frontier life's challenges. Despite their identical appearance, the twins developed distinct personalities, Eleanor being more outgoing and business-minded, while Elizabeth possessed a quiet wisdom, making her a trusted confidant for many Selkirk residents. Sarah, 20 years old and blessed with a voice that could fill the Methodist Church without strain, had become the heart of Selkirk's religious and charitable activities. She organized the church choir, directed holiday pageants drawing audiences from throughout the valley, and led fundraising efforts for families affected by mining accidents or other tragedies. Her compassion and organizational skills made her indispensable to the community's efforts, caring for its most vulnerable members, including widows, orphans, and injured miners. Grace, at 17, had already demonstrated mathematical abilities, astounding her teachers and making her invaluable to her father's increasingly complex business operations. She could calculate compound interest mentally, balance multiple sets of books simultaneously, and spot discrepancies in financial records that escaped experienced bookkeepers' notice. Her father had begun consulting her on major business decisions, and several prominent businessmen remarked that Grace possessed the sharpest financial mind they'd ever encountered in someone so young. Rebecca, the youngest at 14, brought joy and laughter to everyone around her with an infectious personality that could brighten even the darkest winter day. Despite her youth, she'd already shown remarkable maturity by volunteering at the town's small library, where she read to children whose parents worked long hours in mines or shops. Her natural empathy and genuine interest in others made her beloved by families throughout Selkirk, and many predicted she would grow up to become a teacher or nurse, continuing her family's tradition of community service. The Thornfield family's prominence in Selkirk society, however, had begun attracting attention. Gabriel found increasingly uncomfortable. Some residents whispered that his rapid wealth accumulation suggested connections to powerful Eastern interests, while others questioned how a man arriving with virtually nothing had secured financing for such an elaborate home and dramatic business expansion. These suspicions intensified during the summer and early autumn of 1899 as Gabriel began hosting private meetings with well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains and departing before dawn, conducting business in hushed conversations behind his study's closed doors. The political and economic climate of 1899 added another tension layer to life in Selkirk and throughout the American West. The nation still struggled to recover from the devastating economic depression beginning in 1893, and bank failures, business closures, and unemployment continued rippling through communities that had previously enjoyed steady prosperity. Labor disputes were becoming increasingly common and violent in mining communities throughout Montana, Colorado, and Idaho as workers organized demanding better wages, safer conditions, and protection from distant investors' arbitrary power, investors who viewed frontier laborers as expendable resources. The recently formed Western Federation of Miners had actively organized workers throughout Montana, and several mines in neighboring towns experienced strikes, sometimes turning violent when mine owners brought armed guards or called upon territorial authorities for military intervention. Local business owners, including Gabriel Thornfield, found themselves caught between their workers' legitimate demands and Eastern investors' expectations. Investors who cared little for frontier communities' welfare and demanded maximum profits regardless of human cost. This volatile atmosphere was further complicated by rapid changes, railroad expansion, brought to previously isolated communities. The Northern Pacific's extension to Selkirk in 1896 brought unprecedented prosperity, but it also exposed the town to outside influences and criminal organizations preying upon frontier families. Reports circulated of confidence men, land speculators, and various criminal enterprises following railroad lines westward, seeking opportunities to exploit frontier settlements' isolation and limited law enforcement resources. The events of October 12, 1899, began with that kind of crisp autumn morning, making Selkirk residents grateful for their decision to build lives in Montana's spectacular landscape. The maple trees lining the town's main streets had reached peak autumn color, creating a gold and crimson canopy filtering morning sunlight into patterns of extraordinary beauty. Gabriel Thornfield opened his general store at 700 sharp, as was his unchanging custom, while his daughters went about their established daily routines with the comfortable predictability characterizing their family life for years. Margaret walked to the one-room schoolhouse at 800, her leather satchel filled with the lesson plan she'd prepared the previous evening. Parents gathering at the school entrance noticed she seemed more distracted than usual, responding to their greetings with polite but absent-minded nods rather than her typical warm engagement with their concerns about their children's progress. Several mothers later recalled that Margaret's usually immaculate appearance seemed slightly disheveled, as if she'd dressed hastily or without her normal attention to detail. Catherine set up her easel in the garden behind the family home, where she'd been working for several weeks on a landscape painting capturing the Bitterroot Mountains' autumn transformation. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh, living across the street and often watching Catherine work from her kitchen window, noticed the young artist seemed unable to concentrate on her painting, frequently setting down her brush to pace around the garden or stare toward the train station at town's edge. Most unusually, Catherine appeared to be painting the same small canvas section over and over, as if her hands couldn't execute what her mind was trying to create. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, opened their seamstress shop at 900 and immediately began working on the elaborate wedding dress they were creating for Mayor Harrison's daughter. However, their usual cheerful chatter was replaced by intense whispered conversations, stopping abruptly whenever customers entered. Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, bringing in a jacket for alterations, later testified that the twins seemed nervous and distracted, making uncharacteristic measurement mistakes and having to restart their work several times. Sarah spent the morning at the Methodist church practicing hymns for the upcoming Sunday service, but Reverend Thomas Atwood noticed her usually perfect pitch seemed uncertain, and she repeatedly stopped mid-song to stare out windows toward the main street. When he asked if something troubled her, Sarah's response was evasive and uncharacteristic. She claimed to feel slightly unwell, but refused his offer to summon Dr. Porter or send word to her father. Grace worked in the general store alongside her father, but several customers commented she seemed unusually quiet and made simple arithmetic errors completely unlike her normally flawless mathematical abilities. Gabriel himself appeared tense and distracted, frequently checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the street, as if expecting someone or something that failed to arrive on schedule. Even young Rebecca, normally the most carefree and talkative of the sisters, seemed subdued as she helped Mrs. Caldwell with the household's daily cleaning and evening meal preparation. The housekeeper later recalled that Rebecca asked several unusual questions about travel, whether she'd ever been far from Montana, whether she missed her family when working in other towns, and whether she thought it possible to be happy when separated from everyone you loved. As afternoon progressed, the subtle disturbances marking the sisters' behavior throughout the day became more pronounced. At approximately 300, Dr. Samuel Porter was returning from a house call when he encountered all 7 sisters walking together along River Street toward the train depot. This struck him as highly unusual since their daily routines typically kept them occupied with individual responsibilities during afternoon hours, and he'd never seen them all together away from the family home except during church services or special community events. What disturbed Dr. Porter most profoundly was the sisters' demeanor as they walked. Normally vibrant, talkative, and engaged with everyone they encountered, the 7 young women moved in complete silence, their faces pale, their expressions troubled in ways suggesting deep emotional distress. They walked with the mechanical precision of people forcing themselves to complete an unpleasant but unavoidable task, their usual grace and natural warmth replaced by a rigid determination seeming almost military in intensity. When Dr. Porter called out a cheerful greeting, only Rebecca looked back, and the fear in her young eyes chilled him to the bone. The girl's face, normally animated with laughter and curiosity, wore an expression of terror completely incompatible with the safe, familiar surroundings of their hometown. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Dr. Porter later swore Rebecca's gaze conveyed a desperate plea for help that she was powerless to voice aloud. The last confirmed sighting of the Thornfield sisters, as a group, came from Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk at the telegraph office, whose window provided an unobstructed view of the main street and the wooden sidewalk where town residents conducted evening business. At approximately 9:50, Fletcher glanced up from transcribing messages to observe all 7 sisters standing together beneath the amber glow of the street lamp directly outside his office window. Their positioning and body language struck Fletcher as extraordinary and troubling. Rather than the casual arrangement of sisters engaged in conversation or family business, they stood in a precise line facing toward the train station, their posture rigid and attention focused with an intensity suggesting both anticipation and dread. They appeared to be waiting for something or someone specific, their stillness so complete that Fletcher initially wondered if his eyes were playing tricks in the uncertain lamplight. What made this sighting particularly significant was the unusual nature of their clothing. Instead of the practical work dresses or comfortable evening wear they typically chose for family activities, all 7 sisters were dressed in their finest garments. Elaborate dresses more suitable for special occasions or formal social events than for an ordinary Thursday evening in Selkirk. Their hair was arranged with a formality, suggesting careful preparation, and each wore jewelry Fletcher had only seen them display during church services or community celebrations. Most disturbing of all was the collective expression visible on their faces in the lamplight. Rather than the excitement or pleasure that might accompany preparations for a special event, the sisters displayed a combination of resignation and fear, suggesting they were steeling themselves for an ordeal, rather than anticipating celebration. When Fletcher looked up from his work again, approximately 10 minutes later, they had vanished as silently and mysteriously as they'd appeared. The hours that followed remain among the entire mystery's most puzzling aspects, largely because the only witness to events within the Thornfield household was Gabriel himself, whose account of the evening would later prove to contain significant inconsistencies and omissions. According to his initial statement to Sheriff Harding, Gabriel retired to his study at approximately 10:00 to review business correspondence arriving on the afternoon train. He claimed to have spent roughly 90 minutes reading letters and updating business records, a routine that had been his invariable custom for years. Mrs. Caldwell, the family's housekeeper and the only non-family member with regular household access, finished her evening duties and departed for her own cottage at precisely 10:00, as was her established routine. Her later testimony provided crucial details about the atmosphere within the house during those final hours. She described an unusual quietness pervading the entire building. None of the sisters' voices could be heard from their rooms. No footsteps echoed from the upper floors, and even the normal sounds of settling wood and shifting furniture characterizing the large house in the evening seemed muted and strange. Most significantly, Mrs. Caldwell noticed that the usual next day preparations had not been completed. Typically, the sisters would lay out their morning clothing, prepare materials for their various activities, and complete small household tasks, making the next day's routines more efficient. On the evening of October 12th, however, none of these preparations had been made, as if the sisters had abandoned their normal concern for future activities and focused entirely on immediate, undisclosed concerns. Gabriel claimed he went to bed at his normal hour of 11:30, assuming his daughters had already retired to their respective rooms on the second and third floors. His account of his evening routine matched the pattern he'd followed for years: a final check of doors and windows, a brief prayer in the family's small chapel room, and retirement to the master bedroom he'd occupied alone since his wife's death. During their Montana journey, what happened during the hours between 11:30 on the evening of October 12th and dawn on October 13th remains one of the entire case's most perplexing aspects. Gabriel maintained he slept normally and heard nothing unusual during the night. Yet the physical evidence discovered the following morning suggested that extraordinary and carefully coordinated activities had taken place throughout the house while he remained unaware in his bedroom. The discovery transforming the Thornfield disappearance from a family crisis into a nationwide mystery began at dawn on October 13th, when Mrs. Caldwell arrived to begin her daily routine of preparing breakfast and organizing the household for another day. Her key turned easily in the front door, which she found securely locked, as she'd left it the previous evening, and she entered expecting to encounter the familiar sounds and rhythms of a large family beginning morning activities. Instead, she was greeted by a silence so profound and unnatural she later described it as feeling like entering a tomb. No footsteps echoed from upper floors. No voices called morning greetings, and even the mechanical house sounds, clock ticking, wooden beams settling, air whispering through rooms, seemed muted and strange. Mrs. Caldwell's first instinct was to attribute this unusual quiet to the family having overslept, perhaps due to late night activities or the unseasonably cold weather settling over Selkirk during the night. Her concern began escalating when she discovered the kitchen showed no signs of having been used for the late evening snack that was part of the family's established routine. The sisters typically prepared tea and light refreshments around 10:00 each evening, gathering in the kitchen to discuss the day's events and make next day plans. On the morning of October 13th, however, the kitchen remained exactly as Mrs. Caldwell had left it the previous evening: clean, organized, and completely unused. Growing more puzzled and concerned, Mrs. Caldwell climbed the main staircase to the second floor, where Margaret, Catherine, and the twins maintained their bedrooms. The hallway was eerily quiet, with none of the doors standing open, as was typical when the sisters prepared for morning activities. When Mrs. Caldwell knocked softly on Margaret's door and received no response, she hesitantly turned the handle and discovered a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Margaret's bedroom appeared precisely as it would have looked if she'd never retired for the evening. The bed remained made with the same meticulous attention characterizing Margaret's approach to all life aspects. Corners tucked with geometric precision, pillows arranged symmetrically, the coverlet stretched without a single wrinkle. Her nightgown hung on its customary hook near the window, exactly where she'd placed it before dressing for dinner the previous evening. Her brush and comb sat in their usual dressing table positions alongside the small book stack she'd been reading and the lesson plans she'd prepared for the following day's classes. Yet, despite this appearance of perfect order, something felt profoundly wrong about the room. Mrs. Caldwell, who had cleaned and organized this space hundreds of times over the years, immediately sensed subtle changes. The items on Margaret's dressing table, while neatly arranged, were not positioned with the exact precision Margaret invariably maintained. Several books had been removed from shelves and replaced in incorrect order, and the papers in Margaret's desk showed signs of having been examined and restacked by someone unfamiliar with her organizational system. The discovery in Catherine's room was equally disturbing and puzzling. Like Margaret's, the bed showed no signs of having been slept in, and Catherine's artistic materials, brushes, paints, canvases, were arranged with a neatness completely uncharacteristic of her normally chaotic creative space. Catherine typically left her room in a state of organized disorder, reflecting her artistic temperament, with half-finished paintings propped against walls and art supplies scattered across every available surface. On the morning of October 13th, however, everything had been cleaned and organized with an almost obsessive attention to detail entirely foreign to Catherine's personality. The twins' shared bedroom presented the most disturbing evidence of whatever had occurred during the night. Eleanor and Elizabeth had always maintained their space with identical precision, their belongings arranged in perfect symmetry, reflecting their close relationship and shared habits. On the disappearance morning, however, their room showed clear signs of having been systematically searched by someone who had attempted to restore order, but lacked intimate knowledge of the twins' precise organizational methods. Dresser drawers had been opened and closed, their contents examined and replaced, but not in the exact patterns the twins invariably maintained. Mrs. Caldwell's horror reached its peak when she climbed to the third floor and discovered that Sarah's, Grace's, and Rebecca's rooms told the same impossible story. 3 more beds that had never been slept in. 3 more sets of nightgowns hanging undisturbed. 3 more rooms showing subtle but unmistakable evidence of having been carefully searched by someone familiar with the house, but not intimately acquainted with each sister's personal habits and preferences. Her screams, when they finally came, echoed through the morning stillness with such intensity that neighbors came running from blocks away. Mrs. Caldwell ran from the house in a state near hysteria, stumbling through Selkirk streets and crying that the girls were gone, that something terrible had happened, that the impossible had somehow occurred in their safe, familiar community. Gabriel Thornfield, awakened by the commotion and voices gathering outside his home, initially refused to believe what Mrs. Caldwell told him. He rushed through the house, calling his daughters' names and checking each room with desperate hope that some simple explanation would resolve the crisis. Instead, he confronted the same impossible evidence that had terrorized Mrs. Caldwell's 7 bedrooms, showing no signs of having been occupied during the night, yet clear indications that someone had methodically examined every personal belonging, every document, every possession the sisters had accumulated during their Selkirk years. Sheriff William Harding arrived within minutes of being summoned, but nothing in his decade of frontier law enforcement experience had prepared him for the methodical investigation the Thornfield disappearance would require. Harding was accustomed to straightforward crimes: cattle rustling, claim jumping, occasional violence from personal disputes or excessive drinking. The systematic vanishing of 7 young women from a locked house without any evidence of forced entry or signs of struggle presented challenges exceeding both his experience and resources. Harding's initial house examination confirmed Mrs. Caldwell's observations while revealing additional details, deepening the mystery rather than providing explanations. Every door and window remained securely locked from inside with no evidence of tampering or forced entry. The front and back doors showed no signs of having been opened during the night, and all windows were latched in normal positions. Most puzzling of all, there were no footprints in the soft earth around the house's foundation, despite the fact that anyone entering or leaving during the night would necessarily have left clear tracks in the moisture, softened soil. The systematic search of the sisters' belongings became more apparent as Harding conducted detailed room examinations. In every case, personal items had been examined and replaced, but not with the precision indicating familiarity with each sister's habits. Clothing had been unfolded and refolded. Jewelry had been examined and returned to boxes. Personal papers had been read and restacked. Yet nothing appeared missing. Valuable jewelry remained in plain sight. Small money amounts were undisturbed in dresser drawers. Even sentimental items meaningful only to the sisters remained exactly where they'd always been kept. Sheriff Harding's investigation expanded systematically throughout Selkirk as he interviewed every resident who might have observed relevant details during the evening of October 12th or early morning hours of October 13th. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern of strange occurrences and subtle disturbances building throughout the summer and early autumn of 1899, creating an uneasy atmosphere that many residents noticed, but few could articulate clearly. Multiple witnesses reported seeing well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains during the weeks preceding the disappearance. These visitors, always impeccably dressed in expensive Eastern clothing and carrying fine leather luggage, would conduct brief meetings with prominent citizens and then depart on the following morning's train without engaging in any normal social activities characterizing business visits to frontier communities. Their presence was noted not only for obvious wealth and sophistication, but also for deliberate avoidance of the casual interaction customary in small communities where strangers were typically welcomed and included. The telegraph office confirmed unusual volumes of coded messages being sent to Chicago, New York, and San Francisco addresses during the same period. Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk who had witnessed the sisters' final public appearance, revealed these messages were typically sent late in the evening and consisted of seemingly random number and letter combinations, meaning nothing to him, but obviously conveying specific information to intended recipients. Most of these messages were sent by Gabriel Thornfield himself, though several other prominent citizens had also dispatched coded communications to the same Eastern addresses. The town's bank president, Charles Whitman, initially proved reluctant to discuss recent transactions, but Sheriff Harding's persistent questioning eventually revealed financial irregularities, casting Gabriel Thornfield's rapid success in increasingly troubling light. During the 6 months preceding the disappearance, Gabriel had made several large gold coin withdrawals totaling amounts representing significant portions of his accumulated wealth. These withdrawals were unusual not only for size, but also timing. They had occurred immediately following mysterious Eastern stranger visits, suggesting direct connection between these encounters and Gabriel's financial activities. More disturbing still were the bank's records of Gabriel's deposits and investments, showing a wealth accumulation pattern inconsistent with profits reasonably expected from operating a frontier general store. Even accounting for prosperity from Selkirk's silver mines, Gabriel's financial success appeared far to exceed what should have been possible through legitimate commercial activities. Whitman's records indicated Gabriel had received regular payments from Eastern sources with no apparent connection to his retail business, and these payments had increased substantially during months leading up to his daughter's disappearance. As autumn stretched into winter, the case attracted attention from federal investigators and newspaper reporters nationwide. The story of 7 missing sisters captivated the American public with its mystery, tragedy, and corruption hints seeming to epitomize frontier life's darker aspects. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco published detailed disappearance accounts, often accompanied by artists' renderings of the sisters and speculative theories about what might have happened. The federal investigation, led by Inspector Marcus Reed from the Department of Justice, brought resources and expertise far beyond what local authorities could provide. Reed had extensive experience investigating criminal organizations, operating across state and territorial boundaries, and his Thornfield case involvement reflected growing federal concern about organized criminal activities in frontier communities. His investigation would eventually uncover corruption and criminality evidence extending far beyond Montana's borders and involving some of the American West's most prominent business and political figures. Inspector Reed's examination of Gabriel Thornfield's business records revealed financial irregularities, suggesting connections to a sophisticated criminal organization. Gabriel's rapid wealth accumulation coincided precisely with questionable transactions involving mining claims, railroad contracts, and territorial government appointments. Most disturbing were his documented connections to a secretive investment group known as the Rocky Mountain Development Company, which had been acquiring mineral rights throughout Montana and other Western territories using methods local authorities were powerless to investigate or regulate. The Rocky Mountain Development Company proved particularly elusive for federal investigators. The organization operated through a complex network of subsidiary companies, shell corporations, and proxy agents, making it virtually impossible to identify true owners or determine the source of apparently unlimited financial resources. What Reed could establish was that the company had systematically acquired valuable natural resource control throughout the West, often through arrangements involving local officials and prominent citizens receiving substantial payments for cooperation. Gabriel Thornfield's relationship with this organization appeared to have begun shortly after his Selkirk arrival, when he received what his records described as investment capital, enabling business expansion far beyond what normal commercial profits would have allowed. In exchange for financial support, Gabriel had apparently provided the organization with detailed local information about mining operations, land ownership patterns, and political developments affecting regional business opportunities. As winter settled over Selkirk, and the immediate search for the 7 sisters gradually shifted from active investigation to cold case status, the town itself began changes reflecting the trauma and suspicion the disappearance had generated. Several families, uncomfortable with federal investigation implications and attention brought to their community, decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. New residents arrived with no connection to the tragedy and no investment in uncovering the Thornfield sisters' truth. Gabriel himself became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving his empty mansion except to visit the cemetery, where he'd erected 7 marble headstones, despite having no bodies to bury beneath them. His general store, once Selkirk's commercial and social center, was sold to new owners with no knowledge of or interest in the mysterious circumstances leading to Gabriel's community withdrawal. The new proprietors found many of Gabriel's business records destroyed or removed, making it impossible to understand the full extent of his financial relationships or his former prosperity source. The physical evidence of the sisters' former presence gradually disappeared from Selkirk as well. Their clothing and personal belongings were packed away in the mansion's attic. Their artistic and literary community contributions were replaced by activities organized by recent arrivals. Even their names began fading from daily conversation as residents focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on a mystery seeming destined to remain forever unsolved. By spring 1901, many of Selkirk's original residents had departed for opportunities elsewhere, taking with them memories, suspicions, and theories about what really happened to the Seven Sisters. The town emerging from this transition bore little resemblance to the close-knit community existing before October 13, 1899. In its place was a more impersonal settlement populated largely by people with no emotional investment in the Thornfield tragedy and no interest in pursuing investigations threatening their own prosperity opportunities. Selkirk's transformation from a community united by shared history and mutual support into strangers, focused primarily on individual advancement, reflected broader changes occurring throughout the American West. As the 19th century closed, the frontier's promise of limitless opportunity and democratic equality was increasingly challenged by the reality of organized exploitation, systematic corruption, and growing Eastern financial power viewing Western communities as natural resource sources rather than human collections deserving protection and respect. 23 years after the disappearance shattering the Thornfield family and transforming Selkirk, a Chicago discovery would reopen the case and reveal connections stretching far beyond Montana territory. In spring 1922, during an abandoned warehouse demolition on the city's south side, construction workers uncovered a hidden room concealed behind false walls and forgotten for decades. The chamber contained dozens of filing cabinets, storage boxes, and personal items, telling the story of a criminal enterprise operating with impunity throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among artifacts discovered in this hidden archive were 7 small photographs, each showing one Thornfield sister in informal poses, suggesting professional studio work. The images were accompanied by detailed written descriptions of each sister's personality, skills, family background, and physical characteristics compiled with thoroughness suggesting commercial rather than personal interest. Most disturbing of all, the photographs appeared to have been taken after the sisters' Selkirk disappearance, as several showed young women at ages they'd never reached in their Montana home. Margaret appeared in her 30s in the photograph, her face showing the maturity and gravity accompanying adult responsibilities and experiences. Catherine's image captured her in elegant clothing, suggesting prosperity and social status, but her eyes held a sadness incompatible with material success. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been photographed separately rather than together, their identical features showing subtle differences, suggesting distinct personalities developed during separation from each other and family. Sarah's photograph showed her in formal attire, suggesting maintained religious or charitable involvement, but her facial expression conveyed profound melancholy, speaking of deferred dreams and abandoned hopes. Grace, captured in what appeared her mid-20s, wore clothing of a woman engaged in professional activities, but her once bright eyes seemed dulled by experiences crushing natural optimism and intellectual curiosity. Most heartbreaking was Rebecca's image, showing her as a young woman in early 20s, beautiful and properly dressed, but with none of the infectious joy and laughter making her beloved in Selkirk. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department, investigating the warehouse discovery as part of a broader organized crime inquiry, immediately recognized these photographs' significance and accompanying documentation, The materials were part of a vast archive detailing operations of what appeared a sophisticated criminal organization specializing in what they euphemistically called domestic placement services and social advancement opportunities for frontier families. The organization's records, maintained with meticulous detail over several decades, revealed a business model both ingenious and horrifying in its systematic exploitation of vulnerable families throughout the American West. The criminals had identified communities and families whose isolation, economic struggles, or social circumstances made them susceptible to offers promising better lives for their children, particularly daughters. They operated through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matrimonial services, educational institutions, and charitable organizations, providing perfect cover for actual activities. Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed the organization had operated under various names through multiple front companies since at least 1885, systematically targeting frontier families where law enforcement was limited and communication with outside authorities difficult or impossible. Their methods involved careful local condition research, identification of families vulnerable to financial pressure or social manipulation, and sophisticated confidence scheme deployment designed to convince parents they were providing daughters with advancement and prosperity opportunities. The process typically began with well-dressed stranger arrivals presenting as Eastern business, educational institution, or social organization representatives seeking young women for positions promising significant financial rewards and social advancement. These recruiters carried impressive credentials, prominent figure recommendation letters, and detailed proposals seeming to offer genuine opportunities for families struggling with frontier life limitations and hardships. Parents expressing interest in these opportunities were gradually drawn into increasingly complex arrangements involving financial investments, business partnerships, or other commitments making withdrawal difficult once begun. The organization's representatives skillfully identified each family's particular vulnerabilities, financial pressures, social ambitions, concerns about daughters' futures in isolated communities, and crafted proposals addressing these specific concerns, while gradually increasing family dependence on the organization's resources and expertise. The final process stage involved actual young women removal from families and communities, typically accomplished through elaborate deceptions convincing both victims and families they were participating in legitimate opportunities. In some cases, young women were told they were traveling to distant cities for employment or educational opportunities, while families were informed their daughters had decided to pursue independent lives in more sophisticated urban environments. Detective Sullivan's Thornfield case investigation specifically revealed Gabriel's organization involvement had begun much earlier than anyone in Selkirk realized. The hidden archive contained correspondence dating back to 1893, just 1 year after Gabriel's Montana arrival, indicating his rapid business success had been facilitated by the organization in exchange for cooperation in their activities. Gabriel had apparently served as a local agent identifying suitable families and helping coordinate organization operations throughout Montana territory. The letters between Gabriel and handlers revealed a man gradually trapped in obligation and dependency webs he was powerless to escape. His initial involvement had been relatively minor, providing local family information and serving as character reference for organization representatives arriving in Selkirk. However, his role had expanded over time as organization leaders recognized his intelligence, local influence, and desperate need for financial support they provided. By 1899, Gabriel's position had become untenable as federal investigators began examining organization activities, and local residents grew increasingly suspicious of strange visitors and mysterious business dealings characterizing Selkirk's recent prosperity. The organization's leaders had apparently decided Gabriel's usefulness was outweighed by risk he represented, demanding he fulfill his ultimate obligation by providing his own daughters as compensation for investments made in his success. The correspondence revealed Gabriel's growing desperation as he realized the true nature of what was being demanded. His letters showed a man torn between love for daughters and terror of consequences if he refused cooperation with organization demands. The threats against family and community were subtle, but unmistakable: business failures, legal prosecutions, physical violence, social ostracism, destroying everything he'd built in Montana. Most tragic were Gabriel's attempts to find alternatives, satisfying organization demands without sacrificing daughters. He'd apparently explored various possibilities, offering additional financial payments, proposing to recruit other families' daughters, even suggesting relocating entire family to a distant state beyond organization reach. All these proposals were rejected, and Gabriel was informed only surrender of his 7 daughters would satisfy obligations and ensure family safety. The final correspondence entries, dated just days before disappearance, revealed a man accepting inevitability while desperately hoping daughters would somehow survive and eventually forgive him for catastrophic protection failure. He'd been assured his daughters would be well treated, provided comfortable lives, and married to wealthy gentlemen, appreciating their frontier virtues, and providing social and economic advantages unattainable in Montana. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, this conspiracy's horror deepens beyond imagination. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button supporting our content, and don't forget to subscribe for never missing stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this devastating tale of betrayal and systematic exploitation. Gabriel's correspondence revelation and the organization's systematic methods sent shockwaves through American law enforcement, sparking a nationwide investigation into similar disappearances throughout the West. Detective Sullivan's discovery had exposed not just the Thornfield sisters' fate, but evidence of a criminal enterprise operating with near impunity for decades, destroying hundreds of families while enriching a criminal network, corrupting officials at every government level. As federal agents delved deeper into organization records, they uncovered corruption evidence reaching into highest territorial and state government levels, federal law enforcement agencies, and even congressional offices in Washington, D.C. Judges had been systematically bribed or coerced into ignoring missing person cases and dismissing legal challenges, threatening to expose organization activities. Sheriffs and territorial marshals had received regular payments to suppress investigations and intimidate families pursuing missing daughters' cases. Most shocking was discovering several prominent politicians,